Scott is the director of the Michigan State University Counseling Center. He holds a PhD in clinical psychology, and he's worked in several university counseling centers before coming to MSU about 7 years ago. Dr. Becker's clinical and research interests include trauma, depression, couples and family therapy, multiculturalism, spirituality, and other issues. He's developed an integrative model that looks at the impact of technology on neurological and psychosocial development. And when I asked Scott if there was something more personal I could say in this introduction, he shared that he is the father of two and that he and his wife are working hard to limit screen time for their kids in this digital age. And I know that's something that many parents can relate to. So welcome, Dr. Becker, and thank you for this presentation called This is Your Brain Online, the Impact of Digital Technology on Mental Health.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. And we have about maybe 35 minutes to cover information that really I've been gathering over the last few years. And that's problematic for a couple of reasons. One is that some of the information is technical. It's about neuroscience and brain development. It's about psychological development. So there's an intellectual aspect to this that's a little bit challenging, although I try to frame all of that for a general audience. But the other issue, and I think, I personally went through this, the reason for sharing that information about being a parent and trying to apply this information in my own life is that it really does have an emotional impact on really all of the audiences that I've presented this to over the last couple of years. And I think that's for a number of reasons. It's because of the work that we do. It's because of the implications for our professional identities and for the students that we work with if we're in that kind of a setting. But it's also about ourselves. And it's about the children in our own lives. It's about the adolescents in our own lives. And it's about really everyone, because as you'll see from some of the research, the effects that we're going to be looking at apply across the lifespan. Children and adolescents are particularly vulnerable to some of the developmental issues that we'll be looking at, but everyone is subject to being influenced by technology in both a positive way and a negative way. So I just want to encourage people that, this is a lot of information in a relatively short amount of time. Some of it is hard to synthesize sort of intellectually, cognitively, but it's also a lot to take in. And the implications of this are rather broad. So I want to acknowledge that there's an emotional process too, and we won't be able to encompass all of that in the course of this webinar. But as a therapist, I want to encourage people to self-reflect about this, to take time to think about the information, but also to talk to people people you work with, people in your personal life about how this information is influencing you, impacting you. There are lots of positive tips. And one of the things I wanted to say here at the outset is we're going to be focusing almost exclusively on the shadow side of our overuse of digital technology. This is not about how we use computers and phones and tablets. It's about how our over-immersion in that world really has a negative impact on us. So this is an exploration of the shadow side, if that language appeals to anybody. And the other thing I wanted to say here at the beginning is there's an irony in the fact that all this is being presented in a webinar. And I can't tell your reactions to that, and that's part of the point. Technology connects information in ways that we could not possibly have imagined even 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But there's a lot of pros and cons in terms of how it connects or disconnects people. The kind of information that we can share, the kind of connection that we have online is different from the kind of connection we have in person. And usually when I present this information, it's in person. So I can try to engage the audience, decide whether what I'm presenting is going too fast or too slow. Is it too technical? Are there emotional reactions? Are there hands up? We'll try and overcome some of that in terms of the format. We will, you have the opportunity to send in questions, for example. But I just want to acknowledge that the format here is problematic. We're located around the country, around the world. I guess you could say thousands of miles separate some of us. And so there's always that question of when we're online, where are we? And sometimes even the question of who are we? When I'm online, I can be someone else. I can be somewhere else. I can be nowhere. And so the challenge always when we're receiving information online or distributing information online is to stay connected internally to ourselves, to our bodies. This information can be stressful, for example. You may have excitement, you may have anxiety, you may have sadness. I think there's an outrage response on the part of some people when they hear this. So, but being online inherently disconnects us from that. We can be floating heads when we're receiving information in this format. So let's try and overcome that. Let's breathe. Let's remember that we're sitting in a chair or standing in a room, that we're in a particular place and time. And that's sort of my effort to break the fourth wall. But let's press on, and I'll show you some about how I arrived at this topic. But first, let's look at all the different areas that are affected. We'll cover some of these in more detail and some of these more generally. But our overuse of digital technology in all its forms has an impact on sleep. It tends to create problems with deep sleep and quality and quantity of sleep. It also affects our attention spans. They're growing shorter over time. It affects our memory and our capacity to learn, particularly at a deep level. We process a lot of information, but it's in a more shallow way. There is an impact on our stress level. All the bings and dings and whistles and alerts are actually putting us in mild fight or flight. And so our stress level is higher than it used to be. Technology is also literally addictive. It's physiologically and psychologically addictive. And I'll go over some of the research that suggests why. Our mood is also potentially impacted. And I'll show you some of the research on that. And our ability to regulate our emotions, to calm down when we're upset, is less than it used to be, particularly among young people. The term I may throw out occasionally is digital natives, young people who were born into this world of digital technology, those who were texting when they were little, those who now have an iPad in their lap when they're 2. And by the way, don't do that if you can help it with your young people, but especially when they're that young. But our ability to calm down, put on the emotional brakes is less than it used to be. It's affecting folks' identities. Our identities tend to be more fragmented, multiple than they used to be because of all the possibilities online. And our intimacy, our form of communication, the level of communication, particularly the emotional content. It's also affecting empathy, our capacity to read each other's emotions and experiences. And it's increasing potentially our self-referential thinking and talk. There's evidence that the younger generations are more focused on self than on others than they used to be. The implications are something we can talk about at the end. And when I say talk, I guess I mean you text and I respond. But really this is dialogue. And I hope the dialogue continues wherever you are with the people in your lives, face to face, because this is not just abstract information, it's very loaded. So let me say one more thing about context first. Sometimes when I've presented this in the past, I've heavily emphasized the negative outcomes. What I want everyone to keep in mind throughout this talk is that there is, because of the way that this happens, if we focus on neuroscience, because of the way that the changes in the brain happen, they can also change back. There's evidence now coming in that because the brain changes in real time, it's called neuroplasticity for those who are interested in the technical parts, but the brain adapts at a microcellular level to whatever environment it's in. And so the negative changes are happening very quickly. They happen developmentally, but they also happen very quickly. The positive changes can also happen relatively quickly. So I want to present that note of hope at the beginning, and I want people to keep it in mind, because some audiences, when they've heard all this, get pretty down. They say, well, this sounds pretty hopeless. The reason I'm doing this is not to overwhelm people, not to focus just on the shadow or on the bad things that are happening, but really to say, if we start to make changes collectively, individually, then a lot of the negative impact of this can be reversed. People can reconnect with themselves, with their emotions, with their bodies, with each other. There are lots of things that can happen once we recognize that this is happening. So think of this as inoculating you and giving you tools to work with something that can change. This is not irreversible. This is something that can happen anytime, anywhere you want to make a change in your life. So with all that in mind, let's start to look at why I got interested in this. So I'm a university counseling center director. And the directors in my position nationally have been tracking mental health very specifically and very broadly over decades. And historically, the severe disorders who walked in the door in university counseling centers usually constituted about 1 in 6 of the students who walked in the door. About 16% had some kind of severe diagnosis. In the last decade or so, that's jumped up dramatically. So you can see on the slide that we're on, from 92 to 2002, it stays really flat. By 2010, the number of students who had a severe diagnosis, this is in a clinical setting, jumped up to about 44%. And now, as of 2015, it's over 50%. So half the students who walk in the door have a severe disorder. And directors are saying, well, why is that? Maybe students are getting help sooner. Maybe there have been changes in the culture. Maybe we have to live in a fast-paced society. There are lots of explanations, and they're not competing explanations. They're all valid in my opinion. But the one that really hasn't been discussed is the one that we're looking at here. And in my experience, it's fairly overlooked, and there are reasons for that. Clinicians don't usually look at research from neuroscience or from anthropology. The different disciplines don't always talk to each other very well. So some of us just like to try and connect the dots and say, well, what about this in terms of that? And you'll see some other clinicians have been doing that. These are some of the national trends that mental health clinics on campus have been tracking. We've seen an increase in severity. We've seen an increase in students on medication, students who've been hospitalized. And, the numbers of students coming in has increased really across the board. 93% of directors in 2012 reported an increased demand. That's been increasing every year. And universities and university counseling centers are really struggling to keep up with the pace. And in the background, there's this question of why. So I'm just suggesting that there's another answer to why, and it includes the idea that this cohort of students actually has a different style of neurological development. There are differences in the way their brains can cope with stress, can deal with their emotions, and can think. It has lots of academic implications too. So I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but basically this is showing how students at MSU are actually in more distress than the national average. And I think that's one of the reasons why we were able to see this sooner and start to think about it. We were really trying to help our students. So this, for me, came out of a desire to make a difference and to really think about our mental health services. But again, this is not just a mental health issue. It's an academic issue. It's a social issue. And I think it even has implications for our political world too. So, and you can make those connections for yourselves. So these are some of the possible explanations. I won't dwell on all of them, but you can see that, toward the bottom, mental health has been destigmatized. More students are seeking help. There's a lot of collective and cultural anxiety that has to do with terrorism and what you might call at this point domestic terrorism. The awareness on university campuses, for example, that an active shooter incident can occur anytime, anywhere. They're happening more frequently, and mass shootings are happening with more severity in greater numbers. So we're all more anxious than we used to be, and all these things can contribute to this. But if you look at the research we'll be looking at today, there's another background issue that makes us less able to deal with all these other stressful factors. And hopefully we can get through enough of it that the pattern I've seen forming starts to form in your own minds, and you can start to think about this in your own terms. So one of the people who's been exploring this for a long time is Susan Greenfield. She's a professor of pharmacology. She's a neuroscientist at Oxford. And I won't read through this entire slide, obviously, but what she's saying is when you look at brain changes in response to digital technology and our immersion in it, it's an issue as important and unprecedented as climate change. That's a broad statement, but it comes out of a lot of research and a lot of reflection on her part. And so I'm citing that as a way to kind of flag this in your minds as this is actually a serious thing. It's broad enough and the changes are dramatic enough that someone who is a hard scientist, a neuroscientist who's doing the primary research is saying, if we all look at this, if we all knew what I knew, we would be as concerned about it as the fact that the planet is heating up. So the changes occur quickly. In one study at UCLA, novice users to the internet were asked to go on for a total of about 5 hours over the course of a week. And within that course of 1 week, their prefrontal cortex had rewired itself. Our brain adapts to the pace of the information, to the complexity of the information, and that happens very quickly because the brain is trying to interface with the environment. We're trying to adapt to all this information that's coming at us. The really disturbing piece that we'll touch on throughout is the idea that the brain is developing differently. Lots of studies, and these come throughout the world, South Korea, China, Germany, and the US, are noting structural deficits, particularly on the right side of the brain. So the right hemisphere is involved in memory, learning, planning, but especially emotional experience. The right side is the side of the brain that helps us take other people's perspectives. It's the part that gets activated when we feel empathy and connection to someone else's emotional experience. And in these critical areas, some of this is about cognitive ability, some of it is about emotional experience. They're seeing deficits of, in some studies, up to 10 to 20% in terms of gray and white matter. And this is developmental, but it's also somewhat to do with neuroplasticity. So what they're saying is the brains of younger people who've been immersed in this world for the last 10, 15 years or so are showing a relatively intact left hemisphere and a right hemisphere that's not as well developed. Part of the reason for that is we're not having all of the social and emotional experiences that we used to have. And that's when those neural connections form. When you sit down at the dinner table, if you're looking across the table and talking about your day and reacting to each other's stories, there are actual neural connections that develop. But if you're sitting at that same table and everyone is on their device and not making eye contact and not talking to each other, there are critical emotional, social experiences that just don't happen. And so the brain isn't really developing in that way. And so that's having a lot of impact, these researchers are saying, on cognition, on memory, on learning, and on our connection to each other. So one researcher is named Manfred Spitzer. He's in Germany, and this is a light summary of his research, obviously, but his book is called Digital Dementia. He's noting deficits in memory, for example, among young people that we would normally find among those with dementia in later life. So, and he is one of the people, maybe it's because he's German, I don't know, I'm part German myself, but he's quite negative in his predictions about whether some of these deficits can be overcome. Other researchers are more optimistic, and there are other studies that suggest that positive social and emotional experience can actually regrow neural connections. But he is very concerned about what he's seeing in his research. And his book is called Digital Dementia. If you like the technical part of this, then definitely seek that book out. It's in translation in English, and it's worth reading, in my opinion. So the connections between this neuroscience research and the clinical picture, you have a psychiatrist in California named Victoria Dunkley, and she's looking at the research, say, out of China, and the deficits in emotional processing, attention, decision-making, cognitive control, and she's comparing that to the young people, the children and adolescents that she works with, and she comes up with this new diagnosis. It's not really a diagnosis. She's calling it electronic screen syndrome, and she's looking at the symptoms in her clinic, and they directly parallel the deficits that the researchers are looking at. So this is more and more being flagged by clinicians in settings where they're treating younger people for mental health issues, and they're starting to realize maybe some of this is actually to do with brain development. So I know that's unsettling, but that's partly where this picture is coming from. So social media is a big part of this picture. It's not the only thing, but the point here is that it's developed really in the last 10 years or so. I don't know that we all had this timeline in mind, but Facebook has only been around for about 11 years. So most of us weren't exposed to it until adulthood, but we now have a generation that's been using this from a very early age, and their attitudes toward social media and everything to do with the internet are different than older folks, and they're more vulnerable to it, as it turns out. This is the paradox. Alone Together is the title of Turkle's book, and I think that's the copy that's being given away later. But the paradox that we seem to be connected. We have, this is a dark sort of grim joke, but our Facebook friends are not necessarily our real life friends. And the point of the cartoon image here is that in certain moments we realize that, if you work in a clinical setting, for example, students who feel suicidal will sometimes not reach out to anyone in person or even over the phone, but they will post about it in social media, maybe on Facebook, maybe on Twitter, but they put out there their helpless or hopeless or desperate feelings. And a lot of the time, they don't get the response that they anticipated, either no response at all or even a negative response. And so we're starting to come to terms with the idea that social media does not simply make us feel more socially connected. It can also, in certain moments, make us feel suddenly very alone. And I think that tension or that paradox is present a lot of the time. One of the things that amplifies that and illustrates it is this short film. We're testing the technology here, and hopefully this will work. This is a short film about a young woman going through her day. And I'll be silent for a minute.
Driving with a box stuck under his car. And who knows how long he was driving. I saw him pull out of the parking lot and turn right, and the box was still stuck under his car. So who knows how long he was driving with that box under his car. I bet he got home, he pulled into his driveway.
Out in the sky. I'm not. Wow. It's like music. It's not.
I don't think it's real. I don't think it's real.
I see the lineup for cars. We see it. The Empire State Building is really close to it.
So most audiences, when they see that film, have a range of reactions, but the most common one I hear is, that's not really that exaggerated. I think the film deliberately distills a lot of experiences into one person's day, and it's exaggerating slightly, but some young people I've talked to have said it's not exaggerating that much, that all those experiences are familiar in some way or another. They may not happen right in a row or all in one day, but the film isn't really inventing something that's not there. And I think the point is, the kind of connection we have online is not the same as it is in person. It's less emotionally satisfying, and those who are trying to have that more emotional or more direct, more immediate connection are often frustrated now when they realize that a lot of the people that they're close to are living as much in virtual space as they are in what we used to call real life. So increased media exposure. We won't go through all these facts, but the point here is that media usage is increasing dramatically. The number of devices that we have is increasing. The amount of time we spend consuming media in one form or another is increasing. And so, for example, at the bottom of this slide, most Americans own a cell phone. About half of those are smartphones, and that's increasing every year. If you look on this slide, in terms of the total amount of information we receive outside of work, the amount is increased by about 350% in the last, say, 30 years or so. So our brains, our nervous systems are really not hardwired to process all of that. We don't take in all that information, and we're adapting by trying to filter out the things that feel or seem extraneous, that seem less important. And in doing that, our attention spans are shortening, we're paying less attention, we're reflecting less on the information that's coming in because we're trying to match the pace and the complexity of the digital world, and that's having an effect. Among young people, and this will be highly relevant to those who work with teenagers and elementary school children, the average amount of time in 2005 that was spent consuming media per day was about 6.5 hours, or 8.5 when counting multitasking. If you're both watching TV and texting for an hour, that counts as 2 hours. By 2010, over only 5 years, and I don't have a current set of information about this, but we can assume it's increasing, that it jumped to 7.5 hours a day, or 10 hours and 45 minutes with multitasking. There are other studies that suggest up to 12 hours a day or more per young person. And so, the point here is this is the place where young people are spending a lot of their waking time. They're no longer outside playing, they're inside looking at a screen or multiple screens. There's also an effect, and I believe this entire issue is really a social justice issue, but there's also an effect for race and ethnicity, or you could say culture that corresponds to race and ethnicity. So white students have an average of about 8.5 hours of media consumption per day. Black, Latino, and Asian students had about 13 hours per day. One of the hypotheses around this is that students who find less social connection with their peers in real life will gravitate toward using social media as a way to feel more socially connected. So this may make students of color more vulnerable to this effect than white students. And I think that's worth reflecting on in whatever setting you're in. Because what the research is saying is that the more we're immersed in this world, the more it has an impact on brain development and on social and emotional development. So texting has increased dramatically. We won't dwell on the details here, but it's increased 150% over just a few years. The number of texts per month is going up each year, and you can see some of that trend here. So sleep, this is a cute little photo of a cat sleeping with a cell phone. But the effects of this are quite important, actually. They're subtle, but they're quite important. So here's a study, and I've spoken with the researchers at Rensselaer Polytechnic. They have looked at the way in which the backlight of any device, including a backlit television screen or a tablet or a phone, emits a frequency of light that actually reduces melatonin. And melatonin, as many of you may know, is directly related to our capacity to sleep well. So a 2-hour exposure in this study reduced melatonin levels by about 22%. So that's leading to insomnia, early and middle insomnia. It's affecting the amount of sleep, and it's also affecting the quality of sleep. So what they're recommending, and I've talked to them recently about this, are what they call robust changes in light levels throughout the day. So during the day, bright light, in the evening, dim light, and at night, very dark, because our system, our biological system, is designed to respond to light levels. In a natural setting, when the sun goes down, the light gets dimmer, and that helps us sleep, actually. So our tendency to be on our devices or watching television into the late evening and then suddenly turn everything off and try to sleep is actually biologically quite unnatural. And so given that sleep is a consolidating part of the day, it helps the brain process information, it helps us reduce stress levels. It's critically important that this is happening, and it's happening to most people. This is the other reason why sleep is being disrupted. The wireless signal that your phone is receiving, it's at about 884 megahertz, is also received by your nervous system. The reason for that, as it turns out, is that our nervous systems, because they're electromagnetic, have elements in them. They have a metallic element called magnetite, and it's actually a conductor. So between that and the water in our bodies, we're very good walking biological antennas. So if you sleep, and most Americans do, sleep with your phone within reach of your body, of your head, about 68% of people do, then you are actually receiving that signal throughout the night. And again, it's causing decreases in the quality and the quantity of sleep. When I've shared this with people, I've followed up with some later on, and what they're finding, I found this myself, when you move your phone, you have almost the first night, sometimes the first night you move it away from your head, away from your bed, the quality and quantity of your sleep improves dramatically. Some people report dreaming again and realize that since they got their smartphone and since they started using it as their alarm clock, they have actually not been dreaming on a regular basis for years. I had that experience. It had been about 5 years. I realized when I moved my phone, I had 3 vivid dreams that night, and I was thinking, well, when was the last time I remember a dream? And it was about 5 years before I got my phone, before I had it next to my head. So try this. If you get nothing else from this webinar, that's the cliche, right? If you take nothing else away from this conversation, move your phones away from yourselves and from your children when you're sleeping. This same problem, by the way, is affecting bird migration. The signal is disrupting their ability to navigate because they use the polar magnetic field. And so their migration patterns are completely disrupted by our cell phone towers. So it's affecting nature too. So attention, memory, and learning. This is a classroom with lots of students in it, and they're all on their phones. They're all flip phones, so this may be a dated photo. But the teacher, the instructor there is talking to an audience that may or may not be hearing him. And we're going to return to the digital dementia concept. Because the right side of the brain is being affected most dramatically by this, processes such as memory, attention, thinking, emotions, processing ideas are actually being diminished. So that's affecting everything that's happening in the classroom. Our ability to receive the information, process it at a deeper level is not as strong as it used to be, particularly among young people. And this is a UCLA study that essentially focuses on the same issue. The excessive use of texting services and long hours of computer viewing are causing poor memory and declines in attention. Lots of studies like this, but this is a sample. So when you get interrupted, it takes about 25 minutes to recover, and most of our work environments involve very frequent distractions. And so the implication is, if you're interrupted every 11 minutes, you never completely recover your focus and attention. So the tips are to turn off anything that's going to be interrupting you, especially when you're working on a project that requires your sustained attention. The average American attention span, based on research from Microsoft, has decreased from 12 seconds to 8 seconds, and that's now 1 second shorter than the average attention span of a goldfish. That sounds like a joke. I suppose you could make it into a joke, but it's also kind of disturbing because that's a very recent decline, and it means that we're not able to remain focused on things that actually require us to think about them in more depth. We're going to skip this one in the interest of time. I know that's ironic. we're multitasking here, but I do encourage people to review these slides. There's good information, and the studies that they refer to are helpful. So this is important. When we read on a screen, our eyes don't track the information in the same way. It's nonlinear tracking, so we're not reading from left to right, top to bottom. And our brains are not processing the information as deeply because we're not using as much of our language centers as we normally do. So they're now talking about the concept, Marianne Wolf is talking about the biliterate brain. She's hopeful that we can develop 2 different ways of reading. One on the page, where we slow down, where we read from left to right, top to bottom, every word, and we're not darting around the page looking for hyperlinks and trying to get the most relevant information. But Dr. Wolf herself has described the frustration of trying to shift from shallow reading to deep reading. She's mentioning trying to read Hesse's novel, and she's saying, this is the quote, "I'm not kidding, I couldn't do it. It was torture getting through the first page. I couldn't force myself to slow down so that I wasn't skimming, picking out key words, organizing my eye movements to generate the most information at the highest speed. I was so disgusted with myself." And this is a researcher, one of the most well-known researchers that looks at this stuff. So nobody is immune. Knowing this stuff does not make it easier. But being aware of it and changing your habits and deciding when you're going to read something on the page as opposed to on the screen does help. And this is called, like I said, nonlinear reading. What they're suggesting is that style of reading is starting to invade even in other mediums. So you may be learning to read online, but when you open a book, your eyes and your brain are doing similar kinds of adaptive behaviors. And so we're not thinking as deeply, we're not reading in the way we used to. And I'll skip some of these, but they really underline the point. So addiction. What they've found, those who are looking at this, when they do studies, interview studies and fMRI studies, is that because of the intermittent signals, because there's a dopamine burst, for example, you get a pleasurable sensation when you get a message, that is actually physiologically addicting. And as people reflect on that, these are two quotes from people in studies on addiction. It's quite unsettling to realize that you can't go without your phone. If you leave your phone at home, if you go more than 15 minutes without checking, a lot of people experience physiological symptoms of withdrawal and anxiety. And most people check their phone quite frequently. 1 in 5 people check every 10 minutes, which is incredibly frequently. And that obviously that disrupts other forms of attention and thinking and learning and communication. So we'll skip a couple of these. We're going to move through this. The brain scans of internet addicts, these are people who require a clinical level of attention to their internet usage or their gaming usage. Their brain scans actually resemble the brains of drug addicts. So the same kinds of deficits in dopamine receptors that we see in a heroin addict, we also see in an internet addict. And that's quite unsettling.
Scott,
Go ahead,
I'm
please.
just going to interrupt for a second.
Mm-hmm.
We have some questions starting to come in, and we'll hold
Good.
some of those until
I'm sure there are many, yeah.
We'll hold some of those till the end. But someone just asked, Amelia asked whether if e-link, like on an e-reader, also shows nonlinear reading. Do you know about that?
You know, it's difficult to separate out reading styles based on usage of one medium or another because most people are using multiple forms of access to information. So I don't know of one that specifically looks at that. The usual question I get is using a Kindle as problematic as reading online. My general sense, based on all the research I've been looking at, is that the less information that's on the screen, the more stable it is on the screen, and the more likely you are to read it as if you were reading a book, the less of a negative impact it has. But again, if you're also reading online and you're learning, your eyes and your brain are learning nonlinear reading in that context, you're more likely to apply it even if you're using something like an e-reader that's more stable and that's more deliberately trying to mimic a book. So it's an excellent question. I don't think it's been studied at the level of detail that you're asking, but in general, we're not doing it the same way we used to. Other questions at this point, or should I continue?
Let's continue. We'll come back to some other ones.
And I'll try and move some of this, move through some of this a little bit more quickly. But identity and relationships. If you're interested in this, I would highly encourage you to read Sherry Turkle's book. I don't know Dr. Turkle, so this is not. I get no kickbacks for this. But if you're interested in the qualitative piece, the experiential piece, Dr. Turkle is an anthropologist who works at MIT. And she's been studying our relationship to technology for a long time, really since the early 80s. And she's written several books on the topic. I believe there's a new one coming out recently. But if you're interested in how this impacts our experiences, how it impacts our relationships, her work is extremely important. So what we're seeing is that, for example, Turkle did a study. If I'm in a restaurant and I'm talking to my partner, my boyfriend or girlfriend, and the cell phone is on the table, it's within view, what she's found is that negatively impacts the quality of the conversation. If I know the phone is there, if I can just see it within sight, it doesn't have to be on, I don't have to be on the phone, but if I know the phone is there, I won't engage in the same level of conversation. I won't talk about things that are more emotionally laden or more complicated because I know I might get interrupted. And she's done controlled studies on this. So, just that little piece of information really tells us that the technology is coming between us. The phone is coming between us, sometimes literally, but even just implicitly, unconsciously, it's really affecting how deeply we engage each other. And I find that to be really important. How can we separate our connection to the technology so that we can increase our connection to each other? Turkle talks a lot about how we now fear intimacy. There are students, for example, who will not call a suicide hotline because they're not comfortable actually talking to someone, even over the phone. They'd rather text their suicidal crisis, and they're now texting crisis lines that are available. So Turkle's point is that across the board, in terms of intimate relationships, romantic relationships, friendships, we're disengaging and we're leaning more heavily on our media connections as a substitute for that. It feels safer, it feels more manageable, less chaotic, but that's costing us in terms of our deeper emotional connection and the kinds of connections that make us feel calmer, more valued, more understood, happier, better adjusted, more part of something that's outside of ourselves. Those kinds of experiences are decreased because we're leaning so heavily on LinkedIn and Twitter and all the other Instagram, all the other places that we're supposed to connect, quote unquote, but where we're not really feeling it. Because as it turns out, our bodies engage when we're in the same space. There's electromagnetic energy that literally created by our bodies, by our hearts in particular, that interact with the energy created by someone else. This is not New Age or mysticism. It's measurable in terms of electromagnetic energy, and that energy actually has a calming effect when I'm in the presence of somebody who's calm. So there are lots of things that happen in person that just simply can't happen, say, over a webinar, that we don't always know we're missing. And Turkle's very good at drawing out the implicit narratives of people realizing this, but not fully realizing it. So she's an important name in this world, and I encourage you to look at her work. We're going to skip over some of this. Empathy is an important area. What a researcher at the University of Michigan has found, Sarah Conrath, and I've spoken with her about this, college students today are about 40% lower in certain measures of empathy than their counterparts of 20 or 30 years ago. This is using an objective self-report measure of empathy. It's about perspective taking. And in two of the important subscales, the current cohort is just much less likely to be able to feel what the other person is feeling or to focus on it. So interestingly, Conrath is not a neuroscientist. She's not focusing on the neurobiology of this. But as she and I talked about this, she was recognizing that may be one of the major factors. She looks very effectively at the sociological, the cultural factors. But if you combine her work with some of this other research on deficits in the right hemisphere, then you're looking at a group of students that really may not be as easily able to understand or feel what other people are feeling. So that's what, to me, one of the more disturbing parts of this research. It's directly implicated in the deficits in the insula, which is the part of the brain that allows us to understand other people's experience. Another factor in empathy is a study at the University of Southern California. What they discovered was certain kinds of empathy, physical empathy. You stub your toe, I witness that and I flinch immediately. That's automatic, that's instinctual. It happens without reflection or without thought. But other kinds of empathy, more psychological and emotional empathy, require time because they involve the thinking part of the brain, they involve imagination, they involve a connection between our emotional brain and our thinking brain. And that process takes time. So if, and increasingly I think this is true, if we're moving too quickly through our lives, say we watch a YouTube video, it goes for 2 minutes and it's upsetting, but then we just click on the next video, if we don't slow down to reflect on what just happened, we may not fully experience an empathic connection to the other person. That could be because we're driving by the accident. It could be because we're just thinking and moving too quickly. We're stressed out, we're distracted. But what they're saying is processing speed is directly related to empathy. And if we're going too fast, we may not ever develop those capacities, or at least we're not using them. So the positive way of saying this is anytime we slow down, we're much more likely to be able to imagine our way into the other person's world. And that pays dividends in all kinds of ways that I think are obvious to everybody. But slower is better when it comes to empathy and compassion. When we're in person, we talk about ourselves about 60% of the time. When we're on social media, that number jumps to about 80%. So the medium itself is encouraging, we could say, more self-referential thought, more narcissistic kinds of thinking. We're focused on me more than on we when we're online. And they've looked at some of the neuroscience of that. Talking about ourselves is rewarding in the same way that other kinds of stimulants are, like cocaine or food. So we may be actually gravitating toward that kind of talk, and the medium is encouraging it. So another factor for addiction, perhaps, but also, related to this trend toward greater narcissism. There is a book called, by the way, Generation Me, if you're interested in that trend. It's from a USC researcher, and it really looks at the sociocultural aspect of a younger generation that really thinks about the self first and about others second. So this is perhaps the most disturbing example in the entire presentation, and it's a tough note to end on. Perhaps we can go back to other topics, but I need to share this, I think, because it highlights, in some ways, it's an extreme example, but it highlights some of the disconnection and the trends toward decreased empathy and perspective taking. So there is a young man who was a student at the University of Guelph in Canada, and he was on 4chan and was talking to other users and saying, I will complete suicide, I will attempt suicide, I will kill myself online, I will live stream the event, and everyone can watch. He did this. Hundreds of people were watching. Hundreds more wanted to watch and were waiting in queue to watch. And he set his room on fire, he overdosed, he climbed into bed and waited to die. And nobody who was watching online called the emergency services. Someone locally did, and he was rescued, and he did survive. He was in critical condition for a while in the hospital. But on social media afterwards, he was attacked for not having delivered on his promise. People during the attempt were egging him on, saying, why aren't you in the bathtub, and throwing in the toaster? That would be more fun to watch. People were complaining about the lighting. They couldn't see very well what was happening. And, one can easily argue that certain kinds of people were gravitating toward that kind of event. But one can also say, okay, so what does this extreme example tell us about our ability to connect online, to understand and to respond on an emotional level, on, so you could say ethical, moral level to what we're seeing. So I think it's a way of saying this may be pushing us farther apart rather than pulling us closer together. I'll stop there. I think there are lots of other things to talk about, but I appreciate your attention, and I welcome any questions that have already come in or that maybe are coming in now.
Thank you, Scott. This is Janet Olson for all of you out there on the webinar, and I'd like to just look at a couple of the questions that have come in while Scott's been talking, and have us really do take a moment and breathe, because there's been a lot of information, and some of it, as Scott said, is hard to take in.
Exactly.
So please take care of yourselves, do what you need to do. We have a question from Mary, who says, you note the disparity between African Americans and Latinos using more screen time.
Yes.
When many of these individuals may have additional kinds of risk factors. And she's wondering, do you know about a disparity between individuals with disabilities versus others? And her concern is that in her experience, those individuals are often more vulnerable to the addictive properties of screen time, and hence might have less opportunities to develop key social skills and problem solving.
It's an excellent point. It's an excellent question. I don't have research in mind on that topic, but I would agree that especially with certain kinds of disabilities, there is a greater vulnerability to overuse of technology, to finding a community online when that's not being found in their local communities in real life. So I don't have a study to point you toward, but I would say that that's an excellent research question. And more importantly, it's just an important point to keep in mind, is that the appeal of social media and everything in the virtual world is that it takes us away from the painful parts of everyday life, but it also potentially, it can lead us to resources. It can lead us to online support groups. It can lead us to actual support groups. There's a lot of information there, but there is an addictive quality, and there's a risk that as people gravitate toward that form of support, that they stay in the virtual world rather than using it as a portal to real life connection. So I think it's a really good point.
Great, thank you. We have people asking, what can we do? What are suggestions? How much screen time should we give kids? How do we really help young people? And one of our viewers is asking whether mindfulness has been indicated for countering the effects of screen time. Could you speak to that?
Mindfulness has, in fact, been very positively implicated in this. Mindfulness, as it turns out, and they've done now neurological studies, fMRI studies of practiced mindfulness experts. So Tibetan monks have been strapped up to the fMRI machine, and they look at the parts of the brain that are developed in positive ways by mindfulness practice, and they know which areas, based on different forms of practice, are developed. There's an interesting study, for example, on the difference between empathy forms and compassion forms. Empathy tends to emphasize the emotional brain. Compassion tends to emphasize the emotional brain and the cognitive brain, and leads to less burnout than empathy does. Compassion is a more active form of engagement, and it involves thinking as well as feeling. So yes, absolutely. The deficits that we're seeing in digital dementia, to use that term, are counteracted by mindfulness practice. In terms of positive practices, less is more. Earlier in the day is better than later in the day. For young, very young people, no time at all is best. For children under 2 or 3, I would recommend 0 time on screens. And in the classroom, I would encourage anyone who's interested in this to share any version of this information with your school district. I'm doing that here because, again, I have 2 young children, and I'm concerned about trends toward the idea that digital technology is automatically making kids smarter. The stuff I've looked at basically says the opposite, is not helping in cognitive processing and memory and deep learning. And so, the positive use of technology is really offset by the negative aspects, in my opinion. So what I would say is the balance that we need to strike is very different than the balance that we currently have. And the more you look at this research, the more you realize we should be learning information in many other mediums other than using computers and phones and tablets.
Thank you very much, Scott. Appreciate that you brought up schools, because we had a couple of folks who were really seeking some feedback related to what's happening within schools and what schools can do for this.
And what I would say is there are some slides in the presentation that are hidden because I was aware that we wouldn't have enough time, but there are slides for parents and for educators that are, I hope, quite useful. There are also a number of books for those who want to follow up and really find some self-help books on the topic. That's not the literature that I generally emphasize, but there are some now coming up that I think are quite helpful. And for parents or for educators, I'm happy to share that information through the Extension Office.